So you'd think after a terror attack that kills 2 people and injures several others at a synagogue on the holiest day of the Jewish calendar, the country might come together, right? Everyone agrees terrorism is bad. Everyone agrees antisemitism is bad. Everyone rallies around the victims. Wrong. Instead, what happened next was a political shitstorm. Nigel Farage came out swinging at Keir Starmer, accusing him of emboldening the very people celebrating the attack. And honestly, what unfolded over the following days is a masterclass in how a national tragedy gets weaponized for political gain in Britain. Welcome back to UK Secrets, where we're breaking down the bitter dispute that erupted after the Manchester synagogue attack and asking whether either side is actually interested in protecting British Jews or if they're just trying to score political points off a dead body. Let's dive in. Right, so here's the immediate context. A man walked into the Heaton Park Hebrew Congregation Synagogue in Manchester on Thursday, October 2nd, during Yom Kippur, the most sacred day in the Jewish calendar, and launched a murderous attack. 2 people died. Several were seriously injured. It was horrific. It was terrorism. And immediately, Keir Starmer did what you'd expect a prime minister to do. He cut short a meeting with European leaders in Denmark, rushed back to London, held an emergency Cobra meeting, and made a statement. He offered condolences. He praised the emergency responders. He promised increased police presence around Jewish community buildings. He talked about how antisemitism is rising and Britain needs to defeat it. Pretty standard prime ministerial response to a terror attack. Compassionate, measured, appropriate. But then something absolutely bizarre happened. Pro-Palestine protesters showed up at vigils for the victims, and not to pay respects, to celebrate the attack. We're talking about people chanting in support of terrorism, people celebrating dead Jewish worshippers, people turning a mass grave into a political rally. It was genuinely disgusting. Farage saw this and he absolutely lost it. He posted on X saying he'd never seen such vile scenes on our streets. Fair point, right? Those scenes were vile. But then Farage did what Farage does. He pivoted to attacking Starmer. And this is where it gets properly political. He said Starmer had emboldened these protesters by recognizing a Palestinian state just 2 weeks earlier. Think about that accusation for a second. Farage is saying that Starmer's diplomatic recognition of Palestine is directly responsible for creating an atmosphere where people feel safe celebrating a terror attack on British soil. That's a pretty explosive claim. That's saying the Prime Minister's foreign policy is putting British Jews in danger. But Farage wasn't finished. He brought up the fact that Starmer, or rather, Starmer as a private lawyer years ago, had taken a knee in solidarity with Black Lives Matter. And Farage used that to paint Starmer as someone who sympathizes with extremist movements. He said, and never forget, this is a prime minister that took the knee just a few short years ago to an extremist group. Now, there's a lot to unpack there. First, Starmer taking the knee during BLM protests is completely different from what's happening at pro-Palestine rallies supporting a terror attack. Second, Starmer hasn't condemned those pro-Palestine protesters as UN British and called their behavior utterly disgraceful. So if anything, Starmer's response has been pretty tough. But Farage wasn't interested in nuance. He was interested in painting Starmer as weak on antisemitism, weak on extremism, and complicit in creating conditions for anti-Jewish violence. And then Farage went even further. A few days later, he accused the entire Labour government of deliberately ignoring antisemitism to win Muslim votes. He said Labour has chosen to look the other way on antisemitism because it's made a cynical electoral calculation. In other words, Farage is claiming that Starmer and his government are sacrificing Jewish safety on the altar of Muslim electoral support. They are ignoring antisemitism because they think Muslims are a bigger voting bloc than Jews. That's an absolutely damning accusation. That's saying the government is complicit in anti-Semitic violence because of political calculation. And look, there are genuine concerns about antisemitism in Labour. There were major controversies under Jeremy Corbyn. The party has faced legitimate criticism on this issue. But Farage is using a terror attack in dead bodies as a political football. Here's what bothers me about this whole thing. Both Starmer and Farage are doing exactly what they should be criticizing the other for. Starmer's response to the attack was actually pretty good. He condemned the terrorists, praised the emergency services, promised better security, and called out antisemitism as rising. That's appropriate. But then Starmer's government has also been criticized for being cautious about criticizing pro-Palestine activism because of electoral concerns. That's fair criticism. But Farage isn't making a subtle argument about political calculation and electoral strategy. He is making wildly inflammatory claims about Starmer deliberately endangering British Jews, and is doing it while bodies are still warm. He is taking a genuine national tragedy and using it as a weapon in the culture wars. And the really cynical thing is, where was Farage's concern for Jewish safety before the attack? Reform UK, Farage's party, has been gaining ground by positioning itself as a party of British cultural nationalism and traditional values. They've been capitalizing on anti-immigration sentiment, on concerns about rapid demographic change, on anxieties about multiculturalism. Now, none of that is inherently anti-Semitic. Plenty of Jewish people are concerned about immigration and cultural change. But Farage's entire political project has been built on stoking division, on emphasizing differences between communities, on painting minorities as threats. And then when anti-Semitic terrorism happens, he wants to blame it on Starmer's compassion and Starmer's diplomatic recognition of Palestine. It's convenient, it's politically useful, and it completely ignores the actual root causes of antisemitism, which include decades of cultural messaging about threatening outsiders, about communities that don't belong, about demographic invasion. Farage's rhetoric has been part of that landscape. Now, to be fair to Farage, there's a legitimate question about whether Labour under Starmer has been sufficiently robust in condemning antisemitism. And there is a fair debate about whether recognizing Palestine diplomatically sends a message that could inflame tensions. Those are real policy questions. But those questions get completely lost in this political mud wrestling match where Farage is making personal attacks on Starmer's character and suggesting he's complicit in terrorism. Because that's not criticism of policy, that's demonization. And demonization is exactly what's driving antisemitism in the first place. When you paint people as enemies, as threats, as not really British, you create the conditions for violence.